Sci-Fi Classics presents H. Beam Piper's classic science fiction novel, Space Viking. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Enjoy this treasured novel. Space Viking by Henry Beam Piper. Chapter 5. He was crucified and crowned with a crown of thorns. Who had they done that to? Somebody long ago, on Terra. His arms were drawn out stiffly and hurt. His feet and legs hurt too, and he couldn't move them, and there was this prickling at his brow. And he was blind. No, his eyes were just closed. He opened them, and there was a white wall in front of him, patterned with a blue snow crystal design, and he realized that it was a ceiling and that he was lying on his back. He couldn't move his head, but by shifting his eyes he saw that he was completely naked and surrounded by a tangle of tubes and wires, which puzzled him briefly. Then he knew that he was not on a bed, but on a robo-medic, and the tubes would be for medication and wound drainage and intravenous feeding, and the wires would be to electrodes embedded in his body for diagnosis. And the crown of thorns thing would be more electrodes for an encephalograph. He'd been on one of those robo-medics before, when he had been gored by a bisonoid on the cattle range. That was what it was. He was still under treatment. But that seemed so long ago. So many things, he must have dreamed them, seemed to have happened. Then he remembered and struggled futilely to rise. "Elaine!" he called. "Elaine, where are you?" There was a stir and somebody came into his limited view, his cousin, Nikolay Trask. "Nikolay, Andrei Dunnan," he said. What happened to Elaine? Nikolay winced, as though something he had expected to hurt had hurt worse than he had expected. "Lucas," he swallowed. Elaine is dead." "Elaine is dead. That didn't make sense. She was killed instantly, Lucas. Hit 6 times. I don't think she even felt the first one. She didn't suffer at all." Somebody moaned, and then he realized that it had been himself. "You were hit twice," Nikolay was telling him. "One in the leg, smashed the femur, and one in the chest. That one missed your heart by an inch." Pity it did. He was beginning to remember clearly now. "I threw her down and tried to cover her. I must have thrown her straight into the burst and only caught the last of it myself." There was something else. Oh, yes. "Dunnan, did they get him?" Nikolay shook his head. "He got away, stole the Enterprise, and took her off-planet. I want to get him myself." He started to rise again. Nikolay nodded to someone out of sight. A cool hand touched his chin, and he smelled a woman's perfume, nothing at all like Elaine's. Something like a small insect bit him on the neck. The room grew dark. Elaine was dead. There was no more Elaine, nowhere at all. Why? That must mean there was no more world. So that was why it had gotten so dark. He woke again, fitfully, and it would be daylight, and he could see the yellow sky through an open window, or it would be night, and the wall lights would be on. There would always be somebody with him. Nikolay's wife, Dame Cecilia, Rovard Grofis, Lady Lavina Carval. He must have slept a long time, for she was so much older than he remembered, and her brother, Bert Sanderson, and a woman with dark hair, in a white smock with a gold caduceus on her breast. Once Duchess Flavia, and once Duke Angus himself. He asked where he was, not much caring. They told him at the ducal palace. He wished they'd all go away and let him go wherever Elaine was. Then it would be dark, and he would be trying to find her, because there was something he wanted desperately to show her. Stars in the sky at night, that was it. But there were no stars, there was no Elaine, there was no anything. And he wished that there was no Lucas Trask either. But there was an Andrei Dunnan. He could see him standing black-cloaked on the terrace, the diamonds in his beret jewel glittering evilly. He could see the mad face peering at him over the rising barrel of the submachine gun. And then he would hunt for him without finding him, through the cold darkness of space. The waking periods grew longer, and during them his mind was clear. They relieved him of his crown of electronic thorns. The feeding tubes came out, and they gave him cups of broth and fruit juice. He wanted to know why he had been brought to the palace. About the only thing we could do, Rovard Grofis told him. They had too much trouble at Carval House as it was. You know, Cesar got shot too. No, so that was why Cesar hadn't come to see him. Was he killed? Wounded. He's in worse shape than you are. When the shooting started, he went charging up the escalator. Didn't have anything but his dress dagger. Dunnan gave him a quick burst. I think that was why he didn't have time to finish you off. By that time, the guards who'd been shooting blanks from that rapid-fire gun got in a clip of live rounds and fired at him. He got out of there as fast as he could. They have Cesar on a robomedic like yours. He isn't in any danger. The drainage tubes and medication tubes came out. The tangle of wires around him was removed, and the electrodes with them. They bandaged his wounds and dressed him in a loose robe and lifted him from the robo-medic to a couch where he could sit up when he wished. They began giving him solid food and wine to drink and allowed him to smoke. The woman doctor told him he'd had a bad time, as though he didn't know that. He wondered if she expected him to thank her for keeping him alive. "You'll be up and around in a few weeks," his cousin added. "I've seen to it that everything at Trascon Newhouse will be ready for you by then. I'll never enter that house as long as I live, and I wish that wouldn't be more than the next minute. That was to be Elaine's house. I won't go to it alone." The dreams troubled his sleep less and less as he grew stronger. Visitors came often, bringing amusing little gifts, and he found that he enjoyed their company. He wanted to know what had really happened and how Dunnan had gotten away. "He pirated the Enterprise," Rovard Groffis told him. "He had that company of mercenaries of his, and he'd bribed some of the people at the Gorham shipyards. I thought Alex would kill his chief of security when he found out what had happened. We can't prove anything. We're trying hard enough to. But we're sure Omfrey of Glaspith furnished the money. He's been denying it just a shade too emphatically." Then the whole thing was planned in advance. Taking the ship was. He must have been planning that for months before he started recruiting that company. I think he meant to do it the night before the wedding. Then he tried to persuade the Lady Demoiselle Elaine to elope with him. He seems to have actually thought that was possible. And when she humiliated him, he decided to kill both of you first. He turned to Otto Harkerman, who had accompanied him. "As long as I live, I'll regret not taking you at your word and accepting your offer, then." How did he get hold of that Westlands telecast and teleprint car? Oh, the morning of the wedding, he screened Westland's editorial office and told them he had the inside story on the marriage and why the Duke was sponsoring it. Made it sound as though there was some scandal. Insisted that a reporter come to Dunnan House for a face-to-face interview. They sent a man, and that was the last they saw him alive. Our people found his body at Dunnan House when we were searching the place afterward. We found the car at the shipyard. It had taken a couple of hits from the guns at Carval House, but you know what these press cars are built to stand. He went directly to the shipyard, where his men already had the Enterprise. As soon as he arrived, she lifted out. He stared at the cigarette between his fingers. It was almost short enough to burn him. With an effort, he leaned forward to crush it out. "Rovard, how soon will that second ship be finished?" Groffis laughed bitterly. "Building the Enterprise took everything we had. The Duchy's on the edge of bankruptcy now. We stopped work on the second ship 6 months ago because we didn't have enough money to keep on with her and still get the Enterprise finished. We were expecting the Enterprise to make enough in the old Federation to finish the second one. Then, with 2 ships and a base on Tanith, the money would begin coming in instead of going out. But now? It leaves me where I was on Flamberge," Harkerman added. "Worse. King Napoleon was going to help the Elmersons, and I'd have gotten a command in that. It's too late for that now." He picked up his cane and used it to push himself to his feet. The broken leg had mended, but he was still weak. He took a few tottering steps, paused to lean on the cane, and then forced himself onto the open window and stood for a moment staring out. Then he turned. "Captain Harkerman, it might be that you could still get a command here on Graham. That's if you don't mind commanding under me as owner aboard. I am going hunting for Andre Dunnan." They both looked at him. After a moment, Harkerman said, "I'd count it an honor, Lord Trask, but where will you get a ship?" "She's half finished now. You already have a crew for her. Duke Angus can finish her for me and pay for it by pledging his new barony of Trascon. He had known Rovard Grafis all his life. Until this moment, he had never seen Duke Angus's henchmen show surprise. "You mean you'll trade Trascon for that ship?" he demanded. "Finished, equipped, and ready for space?" "Yes." "The Duke will agree to that," Grafis said promptly. "But, Lucas, Trascon is all you own. If I have a ship, I won't need them. I am turning space Viking." That brought Harkonnen to his feet with a roar of approval. Grafis looked at him, his mouth slightly open. "Lucas Trask, space Viking," he said. "Now I've heard everything." Well, why not? He had deplored the effects of Viking raiding on the Sword Worlds because Gram was a Sword World and Trascon was on Gram, and Trascon was to have been the home where he and Elaine would live and where their children and children's children would be born and live. Now the little point on which all of it had rested was gone. That was another Lucas Trask, Rovard. He's dead now. Chapter 6. Grafis excused himself to make a screen call and then returned to excuse himself again. Evidently Duke Angus had dropped whatever he was doing as soon as he heard what his henchman had to tell him. Harkonnen was silent until after he was out of the room, then said, "Lord Trask, this is a wonderful thing for me. It's not been pleasant to be a shipless captain living on strangers' bounty. I'd hate, though, to have you think some time that I'd advanced my own fortunes at the expense of yours. Don't worry about that. If anybody's being taken advantage of, you are. I need a space captain, and your misfortune is my own good luck." Harkonnen started to pack tobacco into his pipe. "Have you ever been off Gram at all?" he asked. "A few years at the University of Camelot on Excalibur. Otherwise, no." "Well, have you any conception of the sort of thing you're setting yourself to?" The space Viking snapped his lighter and puffed. "You know, of course, how big the old Federation is. You know the figures, that is. But do they mean anything to you? I know they don't to a good many spacemen, even. We talk glibly about 10 to the 100th power, but emotionally we still count 1, 2, 3, many. A ship in hyperspace logs about a light year an hour. You can go from here to Excalibur in 30 hours. But you could send a radio message announcing the birth of a son, and he'd be a father before it was received. The old Federation, where you're going to hunt Dunnan, occupies a space volume of 200 billion cubic light-years, and you're hunting for one ship and one man in that. How are you going to do it, Lord Trask?" "I haven't started thinking about how. All I know is that I have to do it. There are planets in the old Federation where space Vikings come and go. Raid and trade bases, like the one Duke Angus planned to establish on Tanith. At one or another of them, I'll pick up word of Dunnan, sooner or later. We'll hear where he was a year ago, and by the time we get there, he'll be gone for a year and a half to 2 years. We've been raiding the old Federation for over 300 years, Lord Trask. At present, I'd say there are at least 200 space Viking ships in operation. Why haven't we raided it bare long ago? Well, that's the answer. Distance and voyage time. You know, Dunnan could die of old age, which is not a usual cause of death among space Vikings, before you caught up with him. And your youngest ship's boy could die of old age before he found out about it. Well, I can go on hunting for him till I die, then. There's nothing else that means anything to me. I thought it was something like that. I won't be with you all your life. I want a ship of my own, like the Coruscant that I lost on Durandal. Some day I'll have one. But till you can command your own ship, I'll command her for you. That's a promise." Some note of ceremony seemed indicated. Summoning a robot, he had it pour wine for them, and they pledged each other. Rovard Grafis had recovered his aplomb by the time he returned accompanied by the Duke. If Angus had ever lost his, he gave no indication of it. The effect on everybody else was literally seismic. The generally accepted view was that Lord Trask's reason had been unhinged by his tragic loss. There might, he conceded, be more than a crumb of truth in that. At first, his cousin Nicolay raged at him for alienating the barony from the family, and then he learned that Duke Angus was appointing him Vicar Baron and giving him Trascon New House for his residence. Immediately he began acting like one at the deathbed of a rich grandmother. The ward-shaven financial and industrial barons, whom he had known only distantly, on the other hand, came flocking around him, offering assistance and hailing him as the saviour of the duchy. Duke Angus's credit, almost obliterated by the loss of the enterprise, was firmly re-established, and theirs with it. There were conferences at which lawyers and bankers argued interminably. He attended a few at first, found himself completely uninterested, and told everybody so. All he wanted was a ship, the best ship possible, as soon as possible. Alex Gorham had been the first to be notified. He had commenced work on the unfinished sister ship of the Enterprise immediately. Until he was strong enough to go to the shipyard himself, he watched the work on the 2,000-foot globular skeleton by screen and conferred either in person or by screen with engineers and shipyard executives. His rooms at the ducal palace were converted, almost overnight, from sick rooms to offices. The doctors, who had recently been urging him to find new interests and activities, were now warning of the dangers of overexertion. Harkerman finally added his voice to theirs. "You take it easy, Lucas." They had dropped formality and were on a first-name basis now. "You got holed pretty badly. You let damage control work on you, and don't strain the machinery till it's fixed. We have plenty of time. We're not going to get anywhere chasing Dunnan. The only way we can catch him is by interception. The longer he moves around in the old Federation before he hears we're after him, the more of a trail he'll leave. Once we can establish a predictable pattern, we'll have a chance. Then sometime he'll come out of hyperspace somewhere and find us waiting for him." "Do you think he went to Tanith?" Harkerman heaved himself out of his chair and prowled about the room for a few minutes, then came back and sat down again. "No, that was Duke Angus's idea, not his. He couldn't put in a base on Tanith anyhow. You know the kind of a crew he has." There had been an extensive inquiry into Dunnan's associates and accomplices. Duke Angus was still hoping for positive proof to implicate Omfrey of Glaspith in the piracy. Dunnan had with him 12.5 employees of the Gorham shipyards whom he had corrupted. There was some technical ability among them, but for the most part they were agitators and troublemakers and incompetent workmen. Even under the circumstances, Alex Gorham was glad to see the last of them. As for Dunnan's own mercenary company, there were about a score of former spacemen among them. The rest graded down from bandits through thugs and sneak thieves to baroom bums. Dunnan himself was an astrogator, not an engineer. "That gang aren't even good enough for routine raiding," Harkerman said. "They'd never, under any circumstances, be able to put in a base on Tanith. Unless Dunnan's completely crazy, which I doubt, he's gone to some regular Viking base planet, like Hoth or Nergal or Dagon or Xochitl, to recruit officers and engineers and able spacemen. All that machinery and robotic equipment and so on that was going to Tanith, was that aboard when he took the ship? Yes, and that's another reason why he'd go to some planet like Hoth or Nergal or Xochitl. On a Viking-occupied planet in the old Federation, that stuff most worth its weight in gold. What's Tanith like? Almost completely Terra-type, third of a Class G sun, very much like Holtekler or Flamberge. It was one of the last planets the Federation colonized before the Big War. Nobody knows what happened exactly. There wasn't any interstellar war. At least you don't find any big slag puddles where cities used to be. They probably did a lot of fighting among themselves after they got out of the Federation. There's still some traces of combat damage around. Then they started to decivilize, down to the pre-mechanical level, wind and water power and animal power. They have draft animals that look like introduced Terran carabaos and a few small sailboats and big canoes and bateaux on the rivers. They have gunpowder, which seems to be the last thing any people lose. I was there 5 years ago. I liked Tanith for a base. There's one moon, almost solid nickel iron, and fissionable ore deposits. Then, like a fool, I hired out to the Elmersons on Durindal and lost my ship. When I came here, your Duke was thinking about Sipototec. I convinced him that Tanith was a better planet for his purpose. Dunnan might go there at that. He might think he was scoring one on Duke Angus. After all, he has all that equipment. and nobody to use it. If I were Dunnan, I'd go to Nurgle or Xochitl. There are always a couple of thousand space Vikings on either, spending their loot and taking it easy between raids. He could sign on a full crew on either. I suggest we go to Xochitl first. We might pick up news of him, if nothing else. All right, they'd try Xochitl first. Harkonnen knew the planet and was friendly with the Halteclair noble who ruled it. The work went on at the Goram shipyard. It had taken a year to build the Enterprise, but the steel mills and engine works were over the preparatory work of tooling up, and material and equipment was flowing in a steady stream. Lucas let them persuade him to take more rest, and day by day grew stronger. Soon he was spending most of his time at the shipyard, watching the engines go in. Abbott lift and drive for normal space, Dillingham hyperdrive, power converters, pseudograv, all at the center of the globular ship. Living quarters and workshops went in next, all armored in collapsium-plated steel. Then the ship lifted out to an orbit 1,000 miles off-planet, followed by swarms of armored workcraft and cargo lighters. The rest of the work was more easily done in space. At the same time, the 4 200-foot pinnaces that would be carried aboard were being finished. Each of them had its own hyperdrive engines and could travel as far and as fast as the ship herself. Otto Harkonnen was beginning to be distressed because the ship still lacked a name. He didn't like having to speak of her as her or the ship, and there were many things soon to go on that should be name-marked. Elaine. Trask thought, at once, and almost at once rejected it. He didn't want her name associated with things that ship would do in the old Federation. Revenge, Avenger, Retribution, Vendetta. None appealed to him. A news commentator, turgidly eloquent about the nemesis which the criminal Dunnan had invoked against himself, supplied it. Nemesis it was. Now he was studying his new profession of interstellar robbery and murder against which he had once inveighed. Otto Harkonnen's handful of followers became his teachers. Van Larch, Guns and Missiles, who was also a painter. Gwat Kirby, sour and pessimistic, the hyperspatial astrogator who tried to express his science in music. Charles Renner, the normal space astrogator. Alvin Carfard, the exec who had been with Harkonnen longest of all. And Sir Patrick Morland, a local recruit, formerly guard captain to Count Lionel of New Haven, who commanded the ground fighters and the combat contragravity. They were using the farms and villages of Traskon for drill and practice, and he noticed that while the Nemesis would carry only 500 ground and air fighters, over 1,000 were being trained. He commented to Rovard Groffis. "Yes, don't mention it outside," the Duke's henchman said. "You and Sir Patrick and Captain Harkonnen will pick the 500 best. The Duke will take the rest into his service. Some of these days, Omfrey of Glaspith will find out what a Space Viking raid is really like. And Duke Angus would tax his new subjects of Glaspith to redeem the pledges on his new barony of Traskon." Some old pre-atomic writer Harkonnen was fond of quoting had said, "Gold will not always get you good soldiers, but good soldiers can get you gold." The Nemesis came back to the Goram yards and settled onto her curved landing legs like a monstrous spider. The Enterprise had borne the Ward Sword and atom symbol. The Nemesis should bear his own badge, but the bisonoid head, Tornion Green of Traskon, was no longer his. He chose a skull impaled on an upright sword, and it was blazoned on the ship when he and Harkonnen took her out for her shakedown cruise. When they landed again at the Goram yards, 200 hours later, they learned that a tramp freighter from Morgley had come into Biglersport in their absence with news of Andre Dunnan. Her captain had come to Wardshaven at Duke Angus's urgent invitation and was waiting for them at the ducal palace. They sat, a dozen of them, around a table in the Duke's private apartments. The freighter captain, a small, precise man with a greying beard, alternately puffed at a cigarette and sipped from a beaker of brandy. "I spaced out from Morgley 200 hours ago," he was saying. "I'd been there 12 local days, 300 galactic standard hours, and the run from Cortana was 320. This ship, the Enterprise, spaced out from there several days before I did. I'd say she's 1,200 hours out of Windsor on Cortana now." The room was still. The breeze fluttered curtains at the open windows. From the garden below, winged night things twittered. "I never expected it," Harkerman said. "I thought he'd take the ship out to the old Federation at once." He poured wine for himself. "Of course, Dunnan's crazy. A crazy man has an advantage, sometimes, like a left-handed knife fighter. He does unexpected things." "That wasn't such a crazy move," Rovard Grafis said. "We have very little direct trade with Katana. It's only an accident we heard about this when we did." The freighter captain's beaker was half empty. He filled it to the brim from the decanter. "She was the first Gram ship there for years," he agreed. "That attracted notice, of course, and his having the blazonry changed from the sword and atom symbol to the blue crescent, and the ill feeling on the part of other captains and planet-side employers about the men he'd lured away from them." "How many men and what kind?" The man with the grey beard shrugged. "I was too busy getting a cargo together for Morglay to pay much attention. Almost a full spaceship complement, officers and spacemen of every kind, and a lot of industrial engineers and technicians. Then he is going to use that equipment that was aboard and put in a base somewhere," somebody said. "If he left Katana 1,200 hours ago, he's still in hyperspace," Guat Kirby said. "It's over 2,000 from Katana to the nearest old Federation planet." "How far to Tanith?" Duke Angus asked. "I'm sure that's where he's gone. He'd expect me to finish the other ship and equip her like the Enterprise and send her out. He'd want to get there first." "I'd thought that Tanith would be the last place he'd go," Harkerman said. "But this changes the whole outlook. He could have gone to Tanith." "He's crazy, and you're trying to apply sane logic to him," Guat Kirby said. "You're figuring what you do, and you aren't crazy. Of course, I've had my doubts at times, but—" "Yes, he's crazy, and Captain Harkerman's allowing for that," Rovard Grafis said. "Dunnan hates all of us. He hates His Grace here. He hates Lord Lucas and Cesar Carvol. Of course, he may think he killed both of them. He hates Captain Harkerman, so how could he score all of us off at once by taking Tanith? You say he was buying supplies and ammunition?" "That's right. Gun ammunition, ship's missiles, and a lot of ground defense missiles." "What was he buying them with? Trading machinery?" "No. Gold. Yes, Lothar Fail found out that a lot of gold was transferred to Dunnan from banks in Glaspith and Didrexburg," Grafis said. "He got that aboard when he took the ship, evidently. All right?" Trask said, "We can't be sure of anything, but we have some reasons for thinking he went to Tanith, and that's more than we have for any other planet in the old Federation. I won't try to estimate the odds against our finding him there, but they're a good deal bigger anywhere else. We'll go there first." Chapter 7. The outside view screen, which had been vacantly grey for over 3,000 hours, was now a vertiginous swirl of colour, the indescribable colour of a collapsing hyperspatial field. No two observers ever saw it alike, and no imagination could vision the actuality. Trask found that he was holding his breath. So, he noticed, was Otto Harkerman beside him. It was something, evidently, that nobody got used to. Even Guat Kirby, the astrogator, was sitting with his pipe clenched in his mouth, staring at the screen. Then, in an instant, the stars, which had literally not been there before, filled the screen with a blaze of splendor against the black velvet backdrop of normal space. Dead in the center, brighter than all the rest, Ertado's star, the sun of Tanith, burned yellowly. The light from it was 10 hours old. "Pretty good, Guat," Harkerman said, picking up his cup. "Good, Gehenna. It was perfect," somebody else said. Kirby was relighting his pipe. "Oh, I suppose it'll have to do," he grudged, around the stem. He had grey hair and an untidy mustache, and nothing was ever quite good enough to satisfy him. "I could have made it a little closer. Need 3 micro-jumps now, and I'll have to cut the last one pretty fine. Now don't bother me." He began punching buttons for data and fiddling with set screws and verniers. For a moment in the screen, Trask could see the face of Andre Dunnan. He blinked it away and reached for his cigarettes and put one in his mouth, wrong end to. When he reversed it and snapped his lighter, he saw that his hand was trembling. Otto Harkerman must have seen that, too. "Take it easy, Lucas," he whispered. "Keep your optimism under control. We only think he might be here. I'm sure he is. He has to be. No, that was the way Dunnan himself thought. Let's be sane about this. We have to assume he is. If we do and he isn't, it's a disappointment. If we don't and he is, it's a disaster. Others, it seemed, thought the same way. The battle station's board was a solid blaze of red light for full combat readiness. "All right," Kirby said. "Jumping." Then he twisted the red handle to the right and shoved it in viciously. Again the screen boiled with coloured turbulence. Again dark and mighty forces stalked through the ship like demons in a sorcerer's tower. The screen turned featureless grey as the pickup stared blindly into some dimensionless no-place. Then it convulsed with colour again, and this time Ertado's star, still in the centre, was a coin-sized disk, with the little sparks of its 7 planets scattered around it. Tanith was the third, the inhabitable planet of a G-class system usually was. It had a single moon, barely visible in the telescopic screen, 500 miles in diameter and 50,000 off-planet. "You know," Kirby said, as though he was afraid to admit it, "that wasn't too bad. I think we can make it in one more micro-jump." Sometime, Trask supposed, he'd be able to use the expression micro about a distance of 55 million miles, too. "What do you think about it?" Harkerman asked him, as deferentially as though seeking expert guidance instead of examining his apprentice. "Where should Gwat put us?" "As close as possible, of course. That would be a light second at the least. If the Nemesis came out of hyperspace any closer to anything the size of Tanith, the collapsing field itself would kick her back. We have to assume Dunnan's been there at least 900 hours. By that time, he could have put in a detection station and maybe missile launchers on the moon. The Enterprise carries 4 pinnaces, the same as the Nemesis. In his place, I'd have at least 2 of them on off-planet patrol. So let's accept it that we'll be detected as soon as we come out of the last jump and come out with the moon directly between us and the planet. If it's occupied, we can knock it off on the way in." "A lot of captains would try to come out with the moon masked off by the planet," Harkerman said. "Would you?" The big man shook his tousled head. "No. If they have launchers on the moon, they could launch at us in a curve around the planet by data relayed from the other side, and we'd be at a disadvantage replying. Just go straight in. You hearing this, Gwat?" "Yeah, it makes sense, sort of. Now, stop pestering me. Charles, look here a minute." The normal space astrogator conferred with him. Alvin Carfard, the executive officer, joined them. Finally, Kirby pulled out the big red handle, twisted it, and said, "All right, jumping." He shoved it in. "I suppose I cut it too fine. Now we'll get kicked back 500,000 miles." The screen convulsed again. When it cleared, the third planet was directly in the center. Its small moon, looking almost as large, was a little above and to the right, sunlit on one side and planet-lit on the other. Kirby locked the red handle, gathered up his tobacco and lighter and things from the ledge, and pulled down the cover of the instrument console, locking it. "All yours, Charles," he told Renner. 8 hours to atmosphere," Renner said. "That's if we don't have to waste a lot of time shooting up Junior there." Van Larch was looking at the moon in the 600 power screen. "I don't see anything to shoot. 500 miles, 1 planet buster, or 4 or 5 thermonuclears," he said. It wasn't right, Trask thought indignantly. Minutes ago, Tanith had been 6.5 billion miles away. Seconds ago, 50-odd million. And now 250,000. And looking close enough to touch in the screen, it would take them 8 hours to reach it. Why, on hyperdrive, you could go 48 trillion miles in that time. Well, it took a man just as long to walk across a room today as it had taken Pharaoh I or Homo sap. In the telescopic screen, Tanith looked like any picture of any Terra-type planet from space, with cloud-blurred contours of seas and continents and a vague mottling of grey and brown and green topped at the pole by an ice cap. None of the surface features, not even the major mountain ranges or rivers, were yet distinguishable, but Harkerman and Charles Renner and Alvin Carfard and the other old hands seemed to recognize it. Carfard was talking by phone to Paul Koreff, the signals and detection officer, who could detect nothing from the moon, nothing that was getting through the Van Allen belt from the planet. Maybe they'd guessed wrong at that. Maybe Dunnan hadn't gone to Tanith at all. Harkaman, who had the knack of putting himself to sleep at will, with some sixth or nth sense posted as a sentry, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Trask wished he could too. It would be hours before anything happened, and until then he needed all the rest he could get. He drank more coffee, chain-smoked cigarettes. He rose and prowled about the command room, looking at screens. Signals and detection was getting a lot of routine stuff. Van Allen count, micrometeor count, surface temperature, gravitation field strength, radar and scanner echoes. He went back to his chair and sat down, staring at the screen image. The planet didn't seem to be getting any closer at all, and it ought to. They were approaching it at better than escape velocity. He sat and stared at it. He woke with a start. The screen image was much larger now. River courses and the shadow lines of mountains were clearly visible. It must be early autumn in the northern hemisphere. There was snow down to the 60th parallel, and a belt of brown was pushing south against the green. Harkaman was sitting up, eating lunch. By the clock, it was 4 hours later. "Have a good nap," he asked. "We're picking up some stuff now. Radio and screen signals. Not much, but some. The locals wouldn't have learned enough for that in the 5 years since I was here. We didn't stay long enough, for one thing. On decivilized planets that were visited by space Vikings, the locals picked up bits and scraps of technology very quickly. In the 4 months of idleness and long conversations while they were in hyperspace, he had heard many stories confirming that. But from the level to which Tanith had sunk, radio and screen communication in 5 years was a little too much of a jump. "You didn't lose any men, did you?" That happened frequently. Men who took up with local women, men who had made themselves unpopular with their shipmates, men who just liked the planet and wanted to stay. They were always welcomed by the locals for what they could do and teach. No, we weren't there long enough for that. Only 350 hours. This we're getting is outside stuff. "Somebody's there beside the locals." Dunnan. He looked again at the battle station's board. It was still uniformly red-lighted. Everything was on full combat ready. He summoned a mess robot, selected a couple of dishes, and began to eat. After the first mouthful, he called to Alvin Carfard. "Is Paul getting anything new?" he asked. Carfard checked. A little contragravity field distortion effect. It was still too far to be sure. He went back to his lunch. He had finished it and was lighting a cigarette over his coffee when a red light flashed, and a voice from one of the speakers shouted, "Detection! Detection from planet! Radar and micro-ray!" Carfard began talking rapidly into a handphone. Harkaman unhooked one beside him and listened. "Coming from a definite point, about 25th North Parallel," he said aside. "Could be from a ship hiding against the planet. There's nothing at all on the moon." They seemed to be approaching the planet more and more rapidly. Actually, they weren't. The ship was decelerating to get into an orbit, but the decreasing distance created the illusion of increasing speed. The red lights flashed once more. "Ship detected, just outside atmosphere, coming around the planet from the west. Is she the Enterprise?" "Can't tell yet," Carford said, and then cried, "There she is in the screen! That spark! About 30 degrees north, just off the west side." Aboard her, too, voices from speakers would be shouting, "Ship detected!" and the battle station board would be blazing red. And Andre Dunnan, at the command desk, "She's calling us." That was Paul Koreff's voice, out of the squawk box on the desk. Standard Swordworld impulse code. Interrogative, "What ship are you?" Informative, "Her screen combination." Request, "Please communicate." "All right," Harkaman said. "Let's be polite and communicate. What's her screen combination?" Koreff's voice gave it, and Harkaman punched it out. The communication screen in front of them lit at once. Trask shoved over his chair beside Harkaman's, his hands tightening on the arms. Would it be Dunnan himself? And what would his face show when he saw who confronted him out of his own screen? It took him an instant to realize that the other ship was not the Enterprise at all. The Enterprise was the Nemesis twin. Her command room was identical with his own. This one was different in arrangements and fittings. The Enterprise was a new ship. This one was old and had suffered for years at the hands of a slack captain and a slovenly crew. And the man who sat facing him in the screen was not Andre Dunnan, or any man he had ever seen before. A dark-faced man with an old scar that ran down one cheek from a little below the eye. He had curly black hair on his head and on a V of chest exposed by an open shirt. There was an ashtray in front of him, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a cigar in it, and coffee steamed in an ornate but battered silver cup beside it. He was grinning gleefully. "Well, Captain Harkerman of the Enterprise, I believe. Welcome to Tanith. Who's the gentleman with you? He isn't the Duke of Wardshaven, is he?" Chapter 8. He glanced quickly at the showback over the screen to assure himself that his face was not betraying him. Beside him, Otto Harkerman was laughing. "Why, Captain Valkenhayn, this is an unexpected pleasure. That's the space scourge you're in, I take it? What are you doing here on Tanith?" A voice from one of the speakers shouted that a second ship had been detected coming over the North Pole. The dark-faced man in the screen smirked quite complacently. "That's Garvin Spasso in the Lamia," he said. "And what we're doing here, we've taken this planet over. We intend keeping it too." "Well, so you and Garvin have teamed up. You two were just made for one another, and you have a little planet all your very own. I'm so happy for both of you. What are you getting out of it beside poultry?" The other's self-assurance started to slip. He slapped it back into place. "Don't kid me. We know why you're here. Well, we got here first. Tanith is our planet. You think you can take it away from us?" "I know we could, and so do you," Harkerman told him. "We outgun you and Spasso together. Why, a couple of our pinnaces could knock the Lamia apart. The only question is, do we want to bother?" By now he had recovered from his surprise, but not from his disappointment. If this fellow thought the nemesis was the Enterprise, before he could check himself, he had finished the thought aloud. "Then the Enterprise didn't come here at all," the man in the screen started. "Isn't that the Enterprise you're in?" "Oh, no, pardon my remissness, Captain Valkenhayn," Harkerman apologized. "This is the Nemesis. The gentleman with me, Lord Lucas Trask, is owner aboard for whom I am commanding. Lord Trask, Captain Boak Valkenhayn of the Space Scourge. Captain Valkenhayn is a space Viking." He said that as though expecting it to be disputed. "So, I am told, is his associate, Captain Spasso, whose ship is approaching. You mean to tell me that the Enterprise hasn't been here?" Valkenhayn was puzzled, slightly apprehensive. "You mean the Duke of Wardshaven has two ships?" "As far as I know, the Duke of Wardshaven hasn't any ships," Harkerman replied. "This ship is the property and private adventure of Lord Trask. The Enterprise for which we are looking is owned and commanded by one Andre Dunnan." The man with the scarred face and hairy chest had picked up his cigar and was puffing on it mechanically. Now he took it out of his mouth as though he wondered how it had gotten there in the first place. "But isn't the Duke of Wardshaven sending a ship here to establish a base?" That was what we'd heard. "We heard you'd gone from Flamberge to Graham to command for him." "Where did you hear this, and when?" "On Hoth. That'd be about 2,000 hours ago. A Gilgamesher brought the news from Xochitl." "Well, considering it was fifth or sixth hand, your information was good enough when it was fresh. It was a year and a half old when you got it, though. How long have you been here on Tanith?" "About 1,000 hours." Harkerman clucked sadly at that. "Pity you wasted all that time. Well, it was nice talking to you, Boak. Say hello to Garvin for me when he comes up." "You mean you're not staying?" Valkenhayn was horrified, an odd reaction for a man who had just been expecting a bitter battle to drive them away. "You're just spacing right out again?" Harkerman shrugged. "Do we want to waste time here, Lord Trask?" "The Enterprise has obviously gone somewhere else. She was still in hyperspace when Captain Valkenhayn and his accomplice arrived here." "Is there anything worth staying for?" That seemed to be the reply Harkerman was expecting. "Beside poultry, that is?" Harkerman shook his head. "This is Captain Valkenhayn's planet, his and Captain Spasso's. Let them be stuck with it." "But look, this is a good planet. There's a big local city, maybe 10 or 20,000 people. temples and palaces and everything. Then there are a couple of old Federation cities. The one we're at is in good shape, and there's a big spaceport. We've been doing a lot of work on it, and the locals won't give you any trouble. All they have is spears and a few crossbows and matchlocks. I know. I've been here. Well, couldn't we make some kind of a deal? Valkenhayn asked. A mendicant whine was beginning to creep into his voice. I can get Garvin on screen and switch him over to your ship. Well, we have a lot of Sword World merchandise aboard, Harkonnen said. We could make you good prices on some of it. How are you fixed for robotic equipment? But aren't you going to stay here? Valkenhayn was almost in a panic. Listen, suppose I talk to Garvin and we all get together on this. Just excuse me for a minute. As soon as he had blanked out, Harkonnen threw back his head and guffawed as though he had just heard the funniest and bawdiest joke in the galaxy. Trask himself didn't feel like laughing. The humor escapes me, he admitted. We came here on a fool's errand. I'm sorry, Lucas. Harkonnen was still shaking with mirth. I know it's a letdown, but that pair of chiseling chicken thieves, I could almost pity them if it weren't so funny. He laughed again. You know what their idea was? Trask shook his head. Who are they? What I called them a couple of chicken thieves. They raid planets like Set and Hertha and Melkarth, where the locals haven't anything to fight with or anything worth fighting for. I didn't know they'd teamed up, but that figures. Nobody else would team up with either of them. What must have happened, this story of Duke Angus's Tanith adventure, must have filtered out to them, and they thought that if they got here first, I'd think it was cheaper to take them in than run them out. I probably would have, too. They do have ships of a sort, and they do raid after a fashion. But now there isn't going to be any Tanith base, and they have a no-good planet, and they're stuck with it. Can't they make anything out of it themselves? Like what? Harkonnen hooted. They have no equipment, and they have no men. Not for a job like that. The only thing they can do is space out and forget it. We could sell them equipment. We could if they had anything to use for money. They haven't. One thing, we do want to let down and give the men a chance to walk on ground and look at a sky for a while. The girls here aren't too bad either, Harkonnen said. As I remember, some of them even take a bath now and then. That's the kind of news of Dunnan we're going to get. By the time we'd get to where he's been reported, he'd be a couple of 1,000 light-years away. He said disgustedly, I agree, we ought to give the men a chance to get off the ship here. We can stall this pair along for a while, and we won't have any trouble with them. The three ships were slowly converging toward a point 15,000 miles off-planet and over the sunset line. The space scourge bore the device of a mailed fist, clutching a comet by the head. It looked more like a whisk broom than a scourge. The Lamia bore a coiled snake with the head, arms and bust of a woman. Valkenhayn and Spasso were taking their time about screening back, and he began to wonder if they weren't maneuvering the Nemesis into a crossfire position. He mentioned this to Harkonnen and Alvin Carthard. They both laughed. Just holding ships meetings, Carthard said. They'll be yakking back and forth for a couple of hours yet. Yes, Valkenhayn and Spasso don't own their ships, Harkonnen explained. They've gone in debt to their crews for supplies and maintenance till everybody owns everything in common. The ships look like it, too. They don't even command, really. They just preside over elected command councils. Finally, they had both of the more or less commanders on screen. Valkenhayn had zipped up his shirt and put on a jacket. Garvin Spasso was a small man, partly bald. His eyes were a shade too close together, and his thin mouth had a bitterly crafty twist. He began speaking at once. Captain, Boak tells me you say you're not here in the service of the Duke of Wardshaven at all. He said it aggrievedly. That's correct, Harkonnen said. We came here because Lord Trask thought another Gram ship, the Enterprise, would be here. Since she isn't, there's no point in our being here. We do hope, though, that you won't make any difficulty about our letting down and giving our men a couple of 100 hours' liberty. They've been in hyperspace for 3,000 hours. See, Spasso clamoured. He wants to trick us into letting him land. Captain Spasso, Trask cut in. "Will you please stop insulting everybody's intelligence, your own included?" Spasso glared at him, belligerently but hopefully. "I understand what you thought you were going to do here. You expected Captain Harkerman here to establish a base for the Duke of Wardshaven, and you thought if you were here ahead of him and in a posture of defence, that he'd take you into the Duke's service rather than waste ammunition and risk damage and casualties wiping you out. Well, I'm very sorry, gentlemen. Captain Harkerman is in my service, and I'm not in the least interested in establishing a base on Tanith." Valkenhayn and Spasso looked at each other. At least in the two side-by-side screens, their eyes shifted, each to the other's screen on his own ship. "I get it!" Spasso cried suddenly. "There's two ships, the Enterprise and this one. The Duke of Wardshaven fitted out the Enterprise, and somebody else fitted out this one. They both want to put in a base here." That opened a glorious vista. Instead of merely capitalizing on their nuisance value, they might find themselves holding the balance of power in a struggle for the planet. All sorts of profitable perfidies were possible. "Why, sure you can land, Otto," Valkenhayn said. "I know what it's like to be 3,000 hours in hyper myself." "You're at this old city with the two tall tower buildings, aren't you?" Harkerman asked. He looked up at the view screen. "Ought to be about midnight there now. How's the spaceport? When I was here, it was pretty bad." "Oh, we've been fixing it up. We got a big gang of locals working for us." The city was familiar. From Otto Harkerman's descriptions, and from the pictures Van Larch had painted during the long jump from Graham. As they came in, it looked impressive, spreading for miles around the twin buildings that spired almost 3,000 feet above it, with a great spaceport like an 8-pointed star at one side. Whoever had built it, in the sunset splendor of the old Terran Federation, must have done so confident that it would become the metropolis of a populous and prospering world. Then the sun of the Federation had gone down. Nobody knew what had happened on Tanith after that, but evidently none of it had been good. At first the two towers seemed as sound as when they had been built. Gradually it became apparent that one was broken at the top. For the most part, the smaller buildings scattered widely around them were standing, though here and there mounds of brush-grown rubble showed where some had fallen in. The spaceport looked good, a central octagon mass of buildings, the landing berths, and beyond, the triangular areas of airship docks and warehouses. The central building was outwardly intact, and the ship berths seemed clear of wreckage and rubble. By the time the Nemesis was following the Space Scourge and the Lamia down, towed by her own pinnaces, the illusion that they were approaching a living city had vanished. The interspaces between the buildings were choked with forest growth, broken by a few small fields and garden plots. At one time there had been 3 of the high buildings, literally vertical cities in themselves. Where the third had stood was a glazed crater with a ridge of fallen rubble lying away from it. Somebody must have landed a medium missile about 20 kilotons against its base. Something of the same sort had scored on the far edge of the spaceport, and one of the 8 arrowheads of docks and warehouses was an indistinguishable slag pile. The rest of the city seemed to have died of neglect rather than violence. It certainly hadn't been bombed out. Harkerman thought most of the fighting had been done with subneutron bombs or omega-ray bombs that killed the people without damaging the real estate. Or bioweapons, a man-made plague that had gotten out of control and all but depopulated the planet. It takes an awful lot of people working together at an awful lot of jobs to keep a civilization running, smash the installations and kill the top technicians and scientists, and the masses don't know how to rebuild and go back to stone hatchets. Kill off enough of the masses, and even if the planet and the know-how is left, there's nobody to do the work. I've seen planets that decivilized both ways. Tanith, I think, is one of the latter. That had been during one of the long after-dinner bull sessions on the way out from Graham. Somebody, one of the noble gentleman adventurers who had joined the company after the piracy of the Enterprise and the murder, had asked, "But some of them survived. Don't they know what happened?" In the old times there were sorcerers. They built the old buildings by wizard arts. Then the sorcerers fought among themselves and went away. Harkerman said. "That's all they know about it. You could make any kind of an explanation out of that." As the pinnaces pulled and nudged the Nemesis down to her berth, he could see people far down on the spaceport floor at work. Either Valkenhayn and Spasso had more men than the size of their ships indicated, or they had gotten a lot of locals to work for them. More than the population of the moribund city, at least as Harkerman remembered it. There had been about 500 in all. They lived by mining the old buildings for metal and trading metalwork for food and textiles and powder and other things made elsewhere. It was accessible only by ox carts traveling 100 miles across the plains. It had been built by a contragravity-using people with utter disregard for natural travel and transportation routes. "I don't envy the poor buggers," Harkerman said, looking down at the ant-like figures on the spaceport floor. "Bokeh Valkenhayn and Garvin Spasso have probably made slaves of the lot of them. If I was really going to put in a base here, I wouldn't thank that pair for the kind of public relations work they've been doing among the locals."